infamous murder of Skylar Neese is one of the most horrifying true crime cases in recent years. And in fact, what helped to solve this crime was the killer's own cryptic tweets about how they killed her. So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case on the murder of Skylar Neese. This is a really talked about case within the true crime community. You might have heard of it before, but it's coming up on the 10-year anniversary now, and this is a super important one, I think, especially considering my audience. A lot of you are young girls, teenage girls, so I think this is a really important one to cover. But before we get into the case, I do just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Function of Beauty. Function of Beauty make 100% customizable hair care products that will do wonders for your hair. I've used them for years, and I don't ever see myself going back to buying just generalized store-bought shampoos and conditioners. All you have to do is fill out a quick 2-minute quiz on their website. You tell them all about your hair and what you want to improve with it, your hair goals. Over the years, I've changed my formula as my hair has changed. Like when I had longer hair, you might have seen I've cut my hair. When I had longer hair, I had really bad split ends, so I always used to pick fixed split ends in the quiz. But these days, I've actually swapped that since I don't have as many split ends anymore. I've swapped it for deep condition. But one thing that stayed consistent in my formula is volumizing. I have always picked that, and I always will, because I love a bit of body in my hair, and honestly, without Function of Beauty, my hair is flat, so flat. And since I've been using Function of Beauty's products, my hair has never been healthier, shinier, fuller. It just has so much more life than it did before. Custom formulas are an absolute game changer because you get exactly everything you need for your hair. And that's something that store-bought shampoos and conditioners just simply cannot give you. And just to let you know, Function of Beauty are 100% vegan and cruelty-free, which is something I love about them, and I know that that's something that a lot of you will value as well. And Function of Beauty are very kindly offering you guys 25% off of your first 16-ounce set when you go through the link down below in the description of this video. Thanks again to Function of Beauty for sponsoring this video. I love you guys so much. But before we go ahead with the case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a couple of smaller content warnings before we get into this case. Today we're going to be talking about themes of drug use and threats of suicide. So if any of that is something that you don't want to hear about right now, I completely understand. Click out of this video now. But all that being said, let's get into the case. Today's case takes place in West Virginia, USA in 2012, where 16-year-old Skylar Neese lived with her mum Mary and her dad Dave. Skylar Annette Neese was born on February 10th, 1996. She was an only child, and she was the apple of her parents' eye. Her mum said that the day that Skylar was born, that was the greatest moment of her whole life. Skylar was a very, very sweet girl. Right from being tiny, she just had a lovely temperament. You know those kids that are just angelic. She was just sweet and kind and smiley and bubbly. She had a heart of gold. She was just so pure and so cute, and she loved animals. She would stop to pet every animal that she passed on the street. So Skylar and her family lived in a small town called Star City in West Virginia, and this was a small town. So small, in fact, it was one of those places that just had a really good like community feel to it, like kind of everyone knew each other kind of vibes. And in this particular area of Star City, they had what was known as the neighborhood shack, which was like a more informal version of a town hall where they would throw like mini events and activities and stuff. And there was a lot of stuff going on for the neighborhood kids there. They would organize a lot of things over the weekends and over school holidays so that the kids could go to these different things while the parents had some time off or the parents went to work or whatever. They would organize like sports and arts and craft days and you know, whatever kids do. And Skylar went to all of these events at the neighborhood shack, and naturally she made quite a few friends there, including an 8-year-old girl named Sheila Eddy, who very quickly became Skylar's best friend. Sheila was actually from out of town. She lived about 20 miles away, but her family was in quite a disadvantaged financial situation. They didn't have a lot of money. Her parents didn't have a lot of money to like take her places and do different things. And a lot of the activities at the neighborhood shack were free. So her parents would take her 20 miles to this neighborhood shack so that Sheila could have all these experiences with the other kids and feel like a normal kid, you know? And yeah, that was where Sheila Eddy and Skylar Neese met, and the two of them became inseparable. They did absolutely everything together. They would have movie nights, they would go to the park together, they grew up together. They became like sisters. But actually, these two girls were kind of like complete opposites of each other. It was like an opposites attract kind of situation. Sheila was very outgoing. She was kind of like a wild child. She was a little bit like rebellious, you know, talked back a little bit. Whereas Skylar, on the other hand, was like, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but like a goody two-shoes. She was like well behaved. She cared very much about like what her parents thought of her, what her teachers thought of her. But like I said, opposites do attract sometimes, and these girls got on like a house on fire. And then in 2010, when the girls were about 14 years old, Sheila Eddy's mother remarried and actually moved so much closer to Skylar. So now these two girls could spend even more time together, and actually that meant that they were going to be going to the same high school. This was so exciting for them. And actually when they did start this high school, that was when they met another girl, and their duo became a trio. This new girl was named Rachel Shoaf. She was the same age as the other two, and she fit in really well with this group. But again, Rachel was very different to the other two. All three of them were so different to each other. Rachel was a lot wealthier. She was a lot more privileged. I think she went to a private school in the past. So again, very different experiences to the other two girls. But again, they all got on really well. Rachel was more similar to Sheila Eddy than she was to Skylar Neese, because Rachel had that same like outgoing, kind of fiery, kind of rebellious energy that Skylar didn't have. And this made for a really interesting dynamic within this group. So Rachel and Sheila, the two outgoing ones, because they were kind of attention-seeky in nature, they would butt heads a lot because they wanted to be the leader of the group, they wanted all the attention, whereas Skylar wasn't so interested in that, so she kind of acted more as a mediator for the group. No one ever had a problem with Skylar. She was kind of like the glue that held that trio together for a while. And as a trio, these three girls were quite popular. They were well known. They had a lot of friends within that school. They were really well liked. But as the girls got into their freshman year of high school, Sheila Eddy started to change. So she'd always been a rebellious wild child, but now it was like in a bad way. It wasn't just like a little misbehaving kid. Now she was kind of getting a bit reckless, because at this age, when you're a teenager, that's when really kind of almost scary elements start getting involved in your life. Partying, alcohol, drugs, older boys. You know, she would go out and sneak out and meet these boys and things like that. Things were getting serious, and Skylar couldn't relate. She like wasn't interested in all that. She wasn't interested in getting drunk and going out and doing drugs and whatever. Bear in mind, they're about 15 years old at this point, so they were getting into this kind of young, I would say. And Skylar told her parents about this. She told them about the path that Sheila Eddy seemed to be taking, and none of them approved. Skylar herself didn't approve, her parents didn't approve, and actually they advised her to maybe try and distance herself from Sheila Eddy. Skylar was a very ambitious girl, and she had dreams of going on to get a really strong career as a criminal defense lawyer. And as Sheila started kind of misbehaving and taking this wrong path, they saw this as a possible hindrance to Skylar's life and her path and her promising future that she was gonna have. So yeah, Skylar agreed with her parents that it probably was time to make some new friends, but it wasn't that easy, because Sheila Eddy had been her best friend since they were like 8 years old. That friendship meant a lot to Skylar. It's not one of those things that you want to drop so easily. She knew that this friend was not healthy for her, but she also didn't want to ditch her completely. It was going to be kind of a long-term, like, distancing kind of process, I guess. So yeah, the following year at school, Skylar starts, you know, getting herself out there, making friends with new girls, different people, and I think Sheila and Rachel started to notice this, and this started to cause a bit of a rift in the trio. I don't think Sheila and Rachel liked that Skylar was doing this. I think they were a little bit jealous. They saw Skylar's potential. They saw that she was really well behaved, she was really intelligent, she had this promising future, and maybe they didn't see that in themselves. And in retaliation to Skylar trying to like distance from them, they started being mean to her. They became a close duo without Skylar. I mean, Skylar was very much still involved, but they wanted her to feel left out. They wanted her to feel like the odd one out. So Sheila and Rachel would plan kind of matching outfits that they would wear to school. They would both wear like stripy jumpers and not tell Skylar about it. So she would turn up at school and feel really left out from this trio. They started going out without her on weekends, having sleepovers without her. They would go to lunch without her and stuff like that. Not all the time, because they wanted her to still want to be friends with them, but they were just trying to make her life a little bit like hell, you know? And this did make Skylar really upset because, like I said, she did want to stay friends with these girls. She knew it was for the best that she should distance, but at the same time, these were still her best friends, and she was really upset that they were doing this. And Skylar actually tweeted about this dynamic as it was happening, saying, "Sick of being fucking home. Thanks a lot, friends. Love hanging out with you all too." But Skylar knew it was for the best, and so she tried to keep herself busy, tried to just push forward with her life, keep meeting new people, keep putting herself out there. She even got a part-time job at Wendy's. She was about 16 years old at this point, so she's really starting to like grow up and mature. She usually worked late shifts at Wendy's, obviously because she had school, she couldn't work during the day, so she would work in the afternoons and evenings. She would usually finish at about 10 p.m. And July 5th, 2012 was no different. She was on one of these late shifts. Actually, this was the day after she wrote that tweet that I just read out. So yeah, on July 5th, 2012, she went to her late shift at Wendy's. She finished at about 10 p.m. and she just came straight home. She was exhausted. She went to bed early. I think she went in the living room and spoke to her parents a little bit before she went to bed, but they knew that she was always tired whenever she would get back from her shift. So Skylar took herself off up to bed, and she had the same shift the following day. So her parents didn't really bother her the next morning. They thought, just let her rest. So her dad went out to work, and then he came back later that day. And this was around the time that Skylar would be getting ready for her next shift. And so he expected to walk in and see her like running around the house, getting her uniform ready, doing her hair, getting ready. But she wasn't. So he went up to Skylar's bedroom and just knocked on the door and just said, "Hi, I'm home." And she didn't respond. So he knocked again. And again, she didn't respond. So now he's a little bit worried, thinking, oh my God, she's still asleep. She's gonna like miss her shift. And so he tried to just go straight in and open the door, but it was locked from the inside. So her dad, Dave, is a bit worried at this point. He can't even hear her inside. He can't hear her moving around, can't hear her breathing. So he decides to like try and pick his way into this room, try and pick the lock. He went and grabbed a wire coat hanger, came back, fiddled with this lock, and eventually got the door open. And when he went inside, Skylar wasn't there. Her bedroom was locked from the inside, but she wasn't in there. It didn't make sense. That was until Dave looked over at the window and saw that it was open. Only by about that much, but it seemed that Skylar had snuck out of her bedroom. And actually what was even more confusing was that her bed was still made and her Wendy's uniform was literally laid on the end of the bed. It seemed like she hadn't even slept there the night before. So now her dad's thinking maybe she got home from her shift last night, took her uniform off, got changed, and then snuck out of the house and maybe spent the night somewhere else. Maybe she'd gone to a party or stayed over at a boy's house or something. But now it was midday the next day and she still hadn't returned home, and she had her next shift at Wendy's in like a couple of hours. And this wasn't like Skylar. Like I said, she was kind of a goody two-shoes. She would never miss a shift at work, ever. So Skylar's dad is panicking by now, and he calls up his wife, Skylar's mother, Mary. And Mary had her own theory. And that was, obviously, she knew that her parents didn't really like Sheila and Rachel at this point. They were bad influences on her. They told her to stop spending as much time with them. And so Mary thought maybe she'd snuck out to go and see those girls because she knew that her parents wouldn't approve. So Skylar's parents got in touch with both Sheila's parents and Rachel's parents and asked them if they'd seen Skylar, asked the girls if they'd seen Skylar, and they all said no, she wasn't with us, she didn't sneak out and spend time with us. So no one had seen Skylar since the day before. And this was like their only theory as well. So now they're really panicking. It's not like she was going to be with anyone else. She didn't really have many other close friends that she could have been with. And her parents are like trying to call Skylar's phone over and over and she's not picking up. Now at this point, the theory was that maybe she was just intentionally ignoring them, because clearly if this theory was right, that maybe she'd gone to a party or to a boy's house, she was having quite a rebellious streak that day. So maybe she's seeing her parents calling her phone over and over again and she's choosing to ignore it. Maybe she knew she'd been caught because her parents are calling her over and over again and she just doesn't want to deal with it. So that was what they were thinking right now. Her parents were just kind of holding out hope that she would return home in the next hour or so. Her shift at Wendy's started at 4 p.m. and like I said, she'd never missed a shift before, ever. So they were hoping that she was going to return home, they were going to get an answer, and then she'd be able to go to work as normal. But then 4 p.m. rolled round, her parents got a call from her manager asking, "Where's Skylar? Is she okay? Is she going to come into work?" She hadn't shown up for her shift and she still wasn't answering her phone. She still hadn't been in contact with anyone. So now her parents are thinking, she must have been with Sheila and Rachel. That is the only explanation that they could think of. And maybe when they asked the girls the first time, they were just lying because they didn't want to be in trouble, because Skylar had snuck out and clearly she'd gotten caught. They didn't want to get involved in that. So now Skylar's parents called once again and they were like, "Look, we kind of know that she was with you." And finally, Sheila Eddy cracked and told the truth. Skylar had snuck out of her room last night to go and meet her and Rachel. Sheila told Skylar's parents that she and Rachel had driven to Skylar's house the night before and picked her up at about 11 p.m. She'd snuck out of her bedroom window to come and go on a drive with them. I think they were literally just driving around, just chatting for a few hours. They said that they were only out for 2 hours maximum, and so they dropped her off home about midnight or 1 a.m. and that was the last time they saw her. Sheila told Skylar's parents that Skylar had actually specifically requested that Sheila drop her off at the end of the road, not directly outside of her house, just in case the noise or the lights from the car woke her parents up. Obviously, she didn't want to get caught sneaking back in, so they dropped her off at the end of the road that night and they hadn't seen or heard from her since. The girls hadn't seen or heard from her parents hadn't, her co-workers hadn't. No one had had contact with Skylar Neese, which meant that she's missing and had been for about nearly 24 hours at this point. So her parents called the police, reported Skylar Neese as missing, and then with the help of volunteers and the police force, they started searching for her, just walking the streets, shouting her name. One of the first things that police did was grab all of the CCTV footage from Skylar Neese's apartment building, because obviously that was going to show where she went and what time she left and everything. And actually they were really lucky because there was one camera that pointed specifically at her bedroom window. So they were going to see her sneak out. And they did. The camera caught Skylar sneaking out of her room at about midnight. There was a bench just outside her bedroom window that she climbed out onto. She pulled the window back down. She left herself a little gap in the bottom so that she'd be able to get back in. And then she walked down the street and towards a car that she presumably got in. It was Sheila and Rachel's car. Now this CCTV footage, while it seems like it should be a good piece of evidence for this case, this specific clip of Skylar leaving the house actually hindered this investigation so much. Because this showed that Skylar Neese left her house that night of her own free will. She chose to sneak out, she walked to this car, got in voluntarily, she wasn't dragged in, she wasn't abducted. She left her house because she wanted to. And this meant that police couldn't actually issue an Amber Alert for her. If you're unfamiliar with Amber Alerts, it's a system over in the States for when a child goes missing and they're in danger. It's basically a broadcast that is sent out to every news station, every radio station. People in the area even get a text on their phones. Everyone gets a text with all the information of this child, where they were last seen, a description, all that kind of stuff. And it's to basically help the news get out to as many people as possible to have the best chances of saving that child that's in danger. But the criteria to be able to send out an Amber Alert, at least back then, was that the child has to be deemed to be in danger. And Skylar Neese wasn't. because she left her house of her own free will. She didn't seem to be in danger. She wasn't abducted. She wasn't dragged into that car. Like I said, she got in voluntarily. And police even had her friends admitting that it was them driving the car. She'd gotten into a car with her own friends. She didn't seem to be in danger from the evidence that they had anyway. So an Amber Alert was never issued for Skylar Neese, which meant that most people in that area didn't even know that there was a missing child, which meant that not everyone was on the lookout, and this investigation just didn't have the manpower that it needed in the beginning, the manpower that it would have had this Amber Alert gone out. And police did actually try and appeal this. Like, the police working on this case wanted an Amber Alert sent out. They tried to appeal it with whoever they go to, higher up somewhere, and it was rejected so many times. How disgusting is that? Like, who is making that decision? Who gets this appeal that there is a missing child that's not been seen for like over 24 hours, going on 48 hours as this case was going on, and they're thinking, no, that's not important enough for an Amber Alert? Who makes that decision? That is awful. But it happened multiple times. This appeal was rejected and rejected and rejected, and an Amber Alert was never sent out. So it was just whatever investigation, whatever manpower that small police force in Star City could pull together. So Skylar's friends and family kind of had to just take matters into their own hands. They formed their own search parties. They printed their own missing persons posters. Everyone was out on the streets giving these things out, talking to people about Skylar, telling them to be on the lookout for her. Loads of people from Skylar's school turned up to help as well, including Sheila Eddy, who was one of the last people to see her. Rachel Shoaf was actually away at like church camp over the summer, so she wasn't as involved in the searches, but Sheila was very much involved. She was coming out every single day in this search to help to try and find her best friend. And Sheila was very, very shaken by this whole thing. She was like crying every day in these searches. She was constantly asking the Neese family for like updates and things like that. She would call Skylar's father nearly every day, asking them how they were doing, offering her help, asking, is there anything I can do to help you and make this easier? In fact, there was one day kind of early on in the investigation where Sheila Eddy went round to the Neese household and just asked Skylar's parents if she could go up to Skylar's bedroom and just sit in there for a minute, just to feel like she was like closer to Skylar. And her parents, of course, said, yeah, go on, go up. And Sheila went and sat on Skylar's bed and just broke down in tears. She was just sobbing in Skylar's room. Skylar's mother, Mary, came in, and the two of them had like a real close moment. They were talking about Skylar, they were hugging, they were crying together. Everyone was so connected in their grief at this point in time. And I say grief because they didn't know what had happened to Skylar. So they didn't know how to feel, but they knew that they were missing her and they knew that they were scared for her. Everyone was so scared and they were supporting each other in this. So as all of this was going on with like the family and Skylar's friends, police were of course trying so many different tactics to try and locate Skylar. They kept calling her phone and it was actually ringing through, which meant it was still switched on, which is a good sign. That means it should be easy to locate. So police got in touch with Apple, since Skylar had an iPhone. They got in touch with Apple and they asked if they could like locate it, send them the location. But Apple refused. And again, this was a similar situation to the Amber Alert because Skylar was actually officially deemed a runaway because she snuck out and left voluntarily. Apple couldn't give over that information because she wasn't kidnapped, she wasn't abducted, she wasn't deemed to be in danger. So it's confidential. Apple wouldn't give over the location of Skylar Neese's phone. The FBI even got involved. The FBI contacted Apple themselves and they were like, look, this is a serious thing. Like, I know you've got your policies, but come on, like, give us the location of this phone. And still, Apple wouldn't even answer to the FBI. There was no way in hell they were giving over that location. And for some reason, there was nothing else police could do. I don't know. I thought they had like other tactics of how they could like locate her phone. But anyway, they could actually never locate her phone. They had no other way of doing it. But one thing they were able to look at was her phone records. I think they'd gotten in touch with like her network provider, And they found that Skylar's phone had been completely inactive since she went missing the night before. Not only that, but her bank had been completely inactive. She wasn't calling anyone, texting anyone. She wasn't spending any money. She wasn't buying food or anything. It wasn't like she'd run away and she was trying to live by herself. It's never a good sign when bank accounts and phone records are completely inactive, because there's no sign that that person is alive right now. This was a really, really frustrating case because everyone just knew that Skylar hadn't run away. She wasn't that kind of girl. As I've kept saying, she was kind of a goody two-shoes. She was so well behaved. This was so out of her character. Everyone knew that something must have happened to her at some point, but because of that evidence, because of that CCTV footage of her leaving voluntarily, there was nothing that could be done. It was a huge, huge hindrance, a huge block from police being able to investigate this whole situation to the fullest extent. And because of that, this investigation continued on for months. Months and months and months, and no one had seen or heard from Skylar Neese in so long at this point that everyone was starting to lose hope. And deep down, once it gets months into a missing persons investigation, deep down, everyone just kind of knew that this wasn't going to be a happy ending. And by then, life kind of has to go back to normal, or as normal as it can get. Obviously, that's harder for Skylar's closer family. But, you know, her friends, Sheila and Rachel, they have to go back to school. They have to continue with their education. They can't just put their life on hold until they have answers. And everyone at that school said that Sheila Eddy and Rachel Shoaf were not the same girls that they were before Skylar went missing. They were a lot more reserved, a lot more quiet. They weren't their usual selves. But they were still normal teenage girls at the end of the day. They did the same things that all the other teenage girls did, and that included social media. They used social media kind of as a coping mechanism to deal with this whole ordeal. Sheila Eddy used social media more so than Rachel. They were both very much on Twitter, very much on Facebook. Sheila Eddy was posting every single day, multiple times a day. Not necessarily about Skylar, although quite a lot of her posts were about Skylar. She would post about how much she missed her. Some of the things she wrote were even addressed to Skylar, as if she was talking to her. Like I said, she would use it as a coping mechanism to feel like she was close to Skylar again. She would beg her to come back, like, Skylar, if you're reading this, come home, no one's mad at you. And Skylar's father, Dave, even commented on a couple of Sheila Eddy's posts saying, like, don't worry, we will find her, she will come home. And I actually have one of Sheila Eddy's Facebook statuses here. I'm going to condense it a little bit because a lot of the ones that she wrote were like big full-on paragraphs, so I'm going to read a few quotes from this one. Skylar, sorry I haven't posted in a while. School has been taking up all my time. I miss you so much in school. Me and Rachel miss you so much, especially at lunch. We sit at the lunch table alone. Come back so we don't look like learners anymore, lol. School is so hard without you. Actually, everything is hard without you. I seriously think about you 24/7 and miss talking to you on the phone day and night. I don't know why you haven't come home yet, but if you're scared that people will be mad at you, they won't be. We just want you home safely. I miss you so, so, so much, more than you could ever imagine, and you will always, always, always be my best friend. Remember that. So throughout this investigation, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Shoaf were regularly interviewed by the police because they were the last people to see Skylar, so they were their best bet of getting like a new lead, I guess. And their stories completely matched. They stayed consistent every single time they were asked. The facts never wavered. I mean, the girls were a little bit anxious, police did notice, but they just kind of put it down to them being young girls in the presence of serious authority. They would fidget in their chairs and kind of play with their hair, avoid eye contact. But like I said, they were 16 years old. They were being regularly questioned by policemen about the disappearance of their best friend. It's natural that they would be quite nervous and anxious in that situation, so police didn't think too much of it. That was until Sheila Eddy made quite an interesting comment in one of her interviews. Completely unprovoked, Sheila said to the police that she would be willing to take a lie detector test and she would pass it because she wasn't lying. And up until now, no one had accused her of lying. No one even thought that. So it was weird that she said that off her own back. Now police were kind of suspicious. If you're not lying, why would you feel the need to clarify that you're not lying when no one's accused you of lying? You know what I mean? So now police were a little bit alert about Sheila Eddy, and so they started to look a little bit closer into both Sheila and Rachel. Because the main theory at this point in the case was actually quite a big rumour that had been going around the neighbourhood for a little while at this point, and that was that maybe Skylar Neese had died of some sort of drug overdose, and now her friends were trying to cover it up because maybe they were scared. And it kind of made sense. I mean, she snuck out of the house late at night, 11 p.m, went and met her friends. All three of them went out, two of them returned, and Skylar didn't. Maybe they'd gone out to a party, like a wild house party. They were experimenting with drugs, mixing with alcohol, and maybe it had been fatal for 16-year-old Skylar. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely heard of these kind of situations happening before where this kind of thing happens, a young person dies from drugs, and then their friends just kind of freak out and they don't know what to do, and maybe they ditch the body somewhere and then they pretend like their friend is missing because they're scared of getting in trouble for what they've done, like taking the drugs and sneaking out and stuff like that. Maybe Sheila and Rachel just didn't want to admit to their parents and police and Skylar's parents, who would have been heartbroken, that they were all out at a party, they snuck out and they were doing all these illegal things. Maybe in their teenage brains, this seemed like an easier thing to do, to like just cover it up. And that was most people's theory right now. A lot of the people in the neighborhood thought that Sheila and Rachel knew more than they were letting on about what had happened to Skylar. Like, even a lot of the parents in the neighborhood thought this. So police wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this theory, and they seized both of the girls' mobile phones so that they could search through them, maybe see what they'd been texting each other over the last few months. And this was when cracks started to show in both of the girls' stories. So if you remember, right in the beginning when Skylar first went missing and those girls admitted that they'd picked her up in the car, they said that they'd picked Skylar up at 11 p.m. But their phones showed that they were texting Skylar for about an hour after that, up until midnight. Which, like, if you're in the car with her, why are you texting her? Surely not. Like, surely you're not sat 2 feet away from each other and you're texting on your phones. Even Sheila would have been driving the car if her story was correct. So how was she texting on her phone? So police decided to go back and look at that CCTV footage, you know, the footage that they got of Skylar sneaking out of her house and going and getting into the car. And luckily, it had the time that it was recorded on it. And Skylar snuck out around midnight. So why had Sheila and Rachel given police the wrong time, an hour earlier? And every single time they'd told police this story, they'd given them the same time, 11 p.m, 11 p.m. Like I said, the facts never wavered. And I know that this is only a small discrepancy. They gave the wrong timing by an hour. It's not that big of a deal, but it's still odd, no? And to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt, that was the only discrepancy that police could find at all in their stories. Both of the girls' stories were the exact same as each other, and that was the only little thing that was a little bit weird. That was until December of 2012, when Rachel Shoaf changed her story a little bit, and Sheila Eddy didn't keep up. Rachel was now telling police that instead of just driving around for a couple of hours and then dropping Skylar off at the end of the night, she changed her story, and now she was saying that they'd all driven out to a woods, like a forest, and they'd all gotten out to talk. Because obviously their friendships were a little bit rocky towards the end. You know, none of them were happy. Skylar had literally tweeted the night before she went missing about how she was unhappy with her friends. So Rachel was saying that they'd picked her up so that they could talk this through. They drove to this forest, got out to speak. But when they all got out of the car to have this conversation, Rachel told police that Skylar just turned around and ran off into the forest. Just ran off into the trees. Didn't say anything to the girls. Didn't say where she was going, why she was doing this. She just ran out into the trees. And Rachel and Sheila were just kind of left at the car, and they didn't follow her straight away. Rachel said after a moment or two, the girls decided to then run into the trees after Skylar, but by then she was too far ahead of them. They couldn't find her. It was dark. They were running around looking for her for a little while, but eventually Sheila and Rachel just got tired. It was late, it was dark, it was cold, and they decided to just go back home. without Skylar. So they said that she'd just run off into this forest and they never saw her again after that. So this was a very interesting development in the case. This was like a whole new part of the story unlocked randomly, and it also just didn't really make that much sense. But anyway, that aside, police decided to bring Sheila Eddy back in for another questioning. They were just going to ask her the whole story again to see what she said, and they asked her if she had anything to add, if she had anything else to tell them, but she said she didn't. She said she'd already told them everything. So now police are really suspicious of these two girls. Now their stories are different. And so once again, maybe about a week later, they call both of them in again, get them to go through the whole stories again. And now Sheila's story had caught up with Rachel's. It seemed that now the girls had had chance to speak to each other, they'd gotten their stories straight, and now their stories matched again, which was weird, because didn't Sheila just tell police that she'd told them everything? And she had nothing else to say. Suspicion of these two girls was growing by the week, and so eventually police decided to send both of the girls off for a polygraph test, a lie detector test. You know, the test that Sheila Eddy was so confident that she would pass. Well, it turns out she failed it. Now, we know that polygraph tests are not entirely accurate. They're not admissible in court because they're not 100% accurate, but they're still a relatively good indicator of whether someone's lying or not. So this was odd. But then it gets even weirder when it comes to Rachel Shoaf's polygraph test, or should I say, attempted polygraph test. Because on the way to the police station to go and take this polygraph test, Rachel was in the car with her dad. He stopped at a red light, and Rachel just freaked out, jumped out of the car, and ran away. I think she ran to Sheila's house. She tried to escape because she didn't want to take that lie detector test. So she never actually took it, but I think that in itself is more telling than any polygraph result she could have gotten. The fact that she was too scared to even get there and take it. And once Skylar Neese's family found out about this, found out that Rachel was trying to dodge the lie detector test, they decided to go public with all the information that they had on this investigation, because up until now, they'd been staying relatively private, you know, just letting police do their thing, letting police do the investigation. But now they weren't staying quiet any longer. And Skylar's mother, Mary, decided to write a Facebook status. In this status, she talked about all the weird little things that had happened throughout this investigation, the change in stories, the lie detector tests, and she shared her suspicions that she thought Sheila and Rachel knew more than they were letting on. And she even said in this status, and this is absolutely heartbreaking, she said that she knew it was unlikely that her daughter was going to come back alive, but at the very least, she just wanted Skylar found, because then at least they could give her like a proper send-off, a proper funeral, and lay her body to rest if she was dead. And this Facebook status that Mary posted went somewhat locally viral in that like town, in that neighborhood, and news of this status ended up getting back to Sheila and Rachel, and they both took it very differently. Sheila was pretty good at hiding her emotions. She was quite like stone cold, whereas Rachel, as we've seen when it came up to the polygraph test, she was a very anxious person, and this status pretty much sent her into a mental breakdown. Her mental state was just getting worse and worse and worse, day by day by day, until 3 days after Christmas, when her mother actually had to call 911 because her daughter was having a full-blown nervous breakdown. She just didn't know what to do with Rachel anymore. She was being violent, she was erratic, she was throwing things, screaming at family members, sobbing, crying, she was threatening to kill herself. And following this phone call to 911, Rachel Shoaf was admitted to a psychiatric unit where she was kept for the next week. And actually, on the day of her discharge from this hospital, she asked her parents if they could take her straight to her attorney's office because she had a confession to make. And from there, Rachel and her lawyer went together to the police station to tell them the truth once and for all. And when she arrived, Rachel was very visibly anxious. She was pale white. She was shaking uncontrollably. And before she even sat down in the interview room with police, because they were going to record all of this, they needed this on record, she asked them if she could have a trash can next to her in the interview room because she felt like she was going to throw up at any minute. She was that nervous. And when she did sit down to talk to them, she just could not get her words out. She was just completely frozen. She was like stumbling over her words. She couldn't get anything out. And so investigators were trying to ask her like leading questions, trying to pull it out of her. They were asking, did Skylar fall and hit her head? Did she overdose? Were you afraid? And Rachel just looked at them, shook her head and said, we stabbed her. And police were just gobsmacked at this admission. They'd known for a while that Sheila and Rachel weren't telling them the whole story, but they never expected the whole story to be murder. Like I said, they'd thought that Skylar had probably overdosed and the girls were just trying to cover it up. But now they were learning that these two teenage girls were murderers. So police just said, tell us everything right from the beginning. Tell us everything in as much detail as you possibly can, starting from when you first got the idea to murder Skylar Neese. And Rachel told police that they had been premeditating this for 9 months. 9 whole months they had been planning to murder their best friend. They murdered her in July and they had been planning it since the September before. She said it all started when Sheila and Rachel were sat next to each other in a science class one day and they realised that Skylar was just always in their way. Because like I said, the two of them were closer than they were to Skylar and they felt like Skylar was just a bit of an annoyance in this trio. And they joked between each other, did Rachel and Sheila, about how much it'd be easier if they could just kill Skylar and then she'd be gone and they wouldn't have to worry about it. Rachel said it was just a dark joke in passing that was just made very flippantly. But then as time went on, Sheila kept bringing it up again, like, oh, wouldn't it be easier if we could just kill Skylar? And then she'd bring it up again the next day, and then the next day. And eventually it wasn't a joke anymore. And she was saying, we should kill Skylar. It'd just be so much easier if we just killed her. At this point in their friendships, Sheila Eddy genuinely didn't like Skylar Neese anymore. She was just kind of putting up with her because they were very different girls. Skylar was still that well-behaved, good girl with a promising future that she'd always been, but Sheila was taking this wrong path. She was, going out to parties, doing all these drugs, meeting all these older boys. She was becoming very different from Skylar, and she was just growing a general distaste for this girl that had always been her best friend. And so Rachel suggested to Sheila that, well, let's just stop hanging out with her then. Let's just hang out, just me and you. Let's, cut her off. But that wasn't enough for Sheila Eddy. And it was the spring of 2012 when the girls started taking this much more seriously and they were actually putting plans to murder Skylar Neese in action. Sheila Eddy had started doing research at home. She was Googling all different things about how to murder someone. She was Googling things like how to dispose of a body, how to feed a human body to pigs. She was even asking her classmates just in science class, how would you dispose of a body? If you had to. And the two of them even went as far to ask Skylar Neese herself how she would want to die. They asked her, if you could die like this or like this, which one would you choose? Between them, Rachel and Sheila decided that the best time to kill Skylar would be in the summer holidays, right before Rachel was due to go to church camp, because then that way, when she goes missing, all of the fuss would die down by the time they got back to school in the fall. Or at least that's what they thought. I don't know why they thought that everyone would just forget that Skylar was missing by September. So that was the vague plan, although they never planned a specific date. And then rolled round July 5th, 2012. And on this particular day, it was now or never for this plan because Rachel was due to go to church camp the very next day. Actually, no, 2 days later, but the very next day she had to go out on the lakes with her family. They hired a boat or whatever. So if they didn't kill Skylar on July 5th, they couldn't do it at all. And they knew that they wanted to do it. They knew that Skylar was working at Wendy's that evening, that she was on a late shift. And so earlier in the day, Rachel and Sheila met up and created what Rachel called a serial killer kit to put in the back of Sheila's car. And this serial killer kit comprised of towels, bleach, cleaning cloths, paper towels, a shovel, and a fresh change of clothes for each of the girls. So they prepared the car because they knew that Sheila was going to be driving and that they were going to go and pick Skylar up. And then they both went back to their individual houses, lived the rest of the day as if they weren't planning to murder someone that same evening. And then that night, before they left the house again, both Sheila and Rachel went to their kitchens and picked out the biggest, sharpest knife that they possibly could, put it in their bags, and then set off to go and pick up Skylar. When they got to Skylar's road, they texted her, letting her know that they were there, and before she could arrive at the car, the two of them slipped their kitchen knives up their sleeves so that they would have easy access in the moment when they needed to use them. They managed to get Skylar out of her house on the premise that they were all going to go out and smoke weed. They all used to go to this one particular place in Pennsylvania. It was just like a forest, and apparently they smoked weed there often. And so they text Skylar about an hour before they picked her up, just basically telling her, do you want to come? Do you want to come and smoke weed with us? And they kind of did it on the premise that they wanted to talk through their friendship. They wanted to like patch things up and make things okay again. So yeah, Skylar agreed to that. They went and picked her up around midnight. They all drove out to Pennsylvania to this forest. And then they all got out of the car to walk into the forest a little bit and go to their usual smoke spot. But as they started walking off into the trees, Sheila Eddy realised that she'd forgotten her lighter. She'd left it at home, and so she asked the other two girls if either of them had one. Skylar didn't, but Rachel said she did. She had one in the car. And this was all part of the plan. This was kind of like their cue. I think they'd kind of agreed to do this beforehand so that they would be able to walk back up to the car together, just the two of them, and kind of leave Skylar lagging behind. And as the two of them turned to kind of walk back up to the car, they gave each other a look. The look. And with that, they counted 1, 2, 3, and the two of them turned on their friend Skylar. Before Skylar could even register what was happening, Sheila and Rachel had pulled these knives out of their sleeves and started frenzied stabbing Skylar Neese in the back. Skylar screamed in horror and tried to run away, but it was 2 against 1. These two girls had more physical power over her, and she couldn't get away. They just kept stabbing her. They managed to get her down onto the floor, and Rachel told police that Skylar couldn't even get any words out. She was trying to utter some kind of sentence, anything, but she couldn't say anything. She could actually only say one word over and over again. She was just asking why. She really tried her best though. She was really fighting for her life against these two girls, and actually at one point she managed to wrestle one of the knives out of one of the girls' hands, and she was kind of using it in self-defense. She was kind of just waving it about in front of her, doing what she could, and in that she managed to make quite a nasty cut on Rachel's leg. And with this, Rachel kind of fell backwards and she stopped stabbing Skylar. I think Rachel fell to the ground and she watched as Sheila just kept going and going and going, and at this point she changed the focus from Skylar's back to her neck. Now she was trying to finish this once and for all. Eventually, Sheila stopped. She stepped back, came and stood with Rachel, and the two of them just watched, stared at Skylar Neese as she died, as she bled out on the floor of this forest. And it was a relatively slow death as well, which is absolutely heartbreaking that they were getting enjoyment out of watching her die, watching the life drain from her. They didn't put her out of her misery. They wanted to watch her slowly and painfully die. In fact, they said she was still making gurgling noises for quite a while because she'd been stabbed in the throat and she was desperately trying to breathe. And they just watched until she eventually stopped. And finally, when the girls were sure that Skylar Neese was dead, they walked back up to Sheila's car and grabbed that serial killer kit with all the towels and the cloths and the spare change of clothes so that they could start covering this up. And this is where their plan went slightly off track, because their initial plan was that they brought shovels, didn't they? So they were gonna try and dig a hole and bury their 16-year-old friend in a shallow grave in this random forest in Pennsylvania, miles and miles away from her family. But as they started trying to dig this hole, they realised that the ground was far too rocky. There was no way they were going to be able to dig a hole big enough to fit Skylar in it. So instead, they had to improvise, and so they just dragged Skylar's body over to a tree. They kind of propped her up by it, and then just tried to cover her up as best as they could with like leaves and rocks and branches so that no one could see her. The two teenage girls then washed the blood off themselves, got changed into their clean clothes, and then just drove back home, leaving their best friend's body just in that forest alone, hoping that it would just eventually decay away into nothing. Between them, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Shoaf had stabbed Skylar Neese over 50 times. And most of those were done by Sheila. And like I said, the two of them just drove home after this and went to bed like nothing had happened. The next day, Rachel woke up and went out on the lake with her family, and then after that she went to church camp. Imagine that, a murderer, a literal murderer at church camp. But Sheila wasn't so lucky. She didn't get to just escape and run as far away from this investigation as she could. She was stuck in that town, and so now she had to make it look as though she actually cared about Skylar, and she had to get involved with the search. And just remember everything that she was doing. She was giving out missing persons posters, calling up the Neese family every single day, asking for updates, asking how they were doing, offering her help. She went and sat on Skylar's bed with her mother, and they sobbed and they hugged and they talked it out. And this whole time, Skylar's mum had no idea that this was her daughter's murderer. And that was Rachel Shoaf's whole confession to the police. Once she'd finished telling them that whole story, police just had one question for her. Why? Why on earth did you two girls do this to your best friend? And the only reason that Rachel Shoaf could give them was that they just didn't like Skylar anymore. So police asked for clarification. They were like, what do you mean you don't like her, so you murdered her? And she couldn't elaborate. She couldn't give them any more than just, I don't know, we don't like her. That was her only reason for murdering this girl, taking this young girl's life so brutally. They just didn't like her. After she'd given this full confession to the police, they then drove Rachel Shoaf out to that forest in Pennsylvania so that she could take them to the exact location of Skylar Neese's body, and then they could finally lay her to rest and confirm this whole story. But frustratingly, when they went out there, turns out that Pennsylvania had had a huge snowstorm, and this whole forest was just covered in a big blanket of white. And I mean, Rachel tried to take them somewhere, but she was just so disorientated. She didn't recognize any of the forest, and she couldn't remember exactly where Skylar's body was. She gave them kind of the best verbal description that she could, but police couldn't do anything now until the snow had melted. And they had to wait weeks and weeks and weeks until eventually this snow melted. They went back out there, and they were able to find Skylar's remains. Finally, on the 16th of January 2013, 6 months after the murder took place, police took sniffer dogs out to that forest and they found Skylar. And it was just as Rachel Shoaf had described in her confession. Skylar's skeleton was propped up against a tree, just covered in branches and leaves and rocks. Forensic teams were brought in to the scene to try and confirm that this was Skylar's skeleton, and around that kind of area they found traces of her blood still on different rocks and stuff. And so they could confirm that this was exactly where the murder had taken place. At this point, Sheila Eddy kind of knew that the net was closing in on her. I don't know if she knew that Rachel had confessed, but I think she could tell based on the way that everyone was acting around her, and she was getting more questionings, and she knew that searches were going on in that field. She knew that Rachel had confessed, yet she was still maintaining her innocence. Sheila was saying that she still had nothing to do with any of it. And when Sheila heard that Skylar's skeletal remains had been found in that forest, she actually tweeted about it. She wrote, "Rest easy, Skylar. You will always be my best friend. I miss you more than you could ever know." And she followed up that tweet with, "Worst day of my whole life." And police and Skylar's family are literally watching this all unfold in real time. They knew by now that that was Skylar's murderer, and she was still trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. She was acting like the innocent, heartbroken best friend. But everyone knew that it was a facade by now. Even Sheila knew that everyone knew she was lying, but she was still trying to keep this up. And it just made all her previous behaviour so sickening. Everyone just felt sick to their stomachs that they had been so supportive and loving with this girl the whole time. Skylar's own family had hugged her most days throughout that investigation. Their own daughter's murderer. But it wasn't just these couple of tweets that related to Skylar, because now that police knew the full story based on Rachel's confession, they went back and looked at the girl's social media posts, and it turns out they'd been cryptically tweeting about the murder that they committed the whole time, for months. Some of them were a little bit more vague than others. Sheila tweeted at one point, "No one on this earth can handle me and Rachel. If you think you can, you're wrong." But then there was one very obvious tweet from Sheila Eddie, which is only obvious in retrospect now that we know the confession. Sheila tweeted, "We really did go on 3. If you remember, Rachel told the police that the two of them gave each other that look, and then they counted 1, 2, 3, and then they turned and started stabbing Skylar. It was part of their plan that they were going to count to 3 and then murder their best friend." So now police needed more evidence against Sheila Eddy to be able to finally arrest and charge her for her part in the murder, and so they got a search warrant for both her house and her car. There wasn't much to be found inside Sheila's house. However, in her car, forensic teams found traces of Skylar Neese's blood. And this just confirmed Rachel Shoaf's confession story. But it was something that police found in Skylar's own bedroom that really flipped this investigation on its head. It finally gave police a better understanding of this case and the real motive behind the murder. Because like I said, Rachel said their motive was that they just didn't like Skylar anymore. They just didn't like her. She was annoying. She was in the way. But that didn't make sense. People get annoyed by people all the time. People stop liking people all the time. But no one turns around and murders them. That just didn't make sense to police. They knew there had to be more to it. And now that they found Skylar's diary, they realised that there was way more to it. In Skylar's own diary, she had written about how Rachel and Sheila, her two murderers, were actually way more than just friends. In fact, an exact quote from that diary is that they'd tried everything that two girls could try together. Sheila Eddy and Rachel Shoaf were in a secret relationship. Well, maybe not an exact relationship, but they were certainly a thing. And a lot of the things that they would do together romantically and sexually, they would do in front of Skylar. And this would make her feel quite uncomfortable because the girls would literally be like, naked, making out on the sofa next to Skylar, and I think that would make anyone uncomfortable. She was not consenting to be in the room witnessing that, you know? There was even one story about how they locked her in the bathroom with them as they were like making out in the bath or something. No one wants to be in that situation. And Skylar didn't. And Skylar wrote about this in her journal, in her diary, quite a few times, that this made her feel so uncomfortable. But then there was one particular diary entry about one situation where Skylar had taken a selfie, I think they were all having a sleepover. Skylar had taken a selfie, and in the background was Sheila and Rachel making out. And when they found out that Skylar had taken this picture, those girls went crazy. Like, they didn't want that photo getting out for kind of obvious reasons, because Rachel's family were very religious. They were not supportive of LGBT communities at all, and Rachel knew that if this got out, it would be a huge problem. And police think that this picture was the trigger for them to switch from their plan, you know, their original plan of just cutting her off and, you know, becoming best friends without her. That was no longer enough. They needed to make sure that there was no way that picture would ever get out. And if they did just cut Skylar off and, you know, move on without her, there was always the chance that she could take it quite badly and retaliate by maybe posting that picture online or sending it to the girl's parents or something like that. And they couldn't risk that happening. And police think that that was when the girls took matters into their own hands and started seriously planning Skylar Neese's murder. Finally, on May 1st, 2013, Sheila Eddy was arrested and charged with the murder of Skylar Neese. And she was actually arrested while she was out for lunch with her mother. And so people saw this happening. You know, people in that restaurant saw it happening, and the news travelled so fast. Like, people were posting on social media straight away. And so Rachel actually wasn't arrested at this point. I don't know why, because she'd literally confessed to murder. But anyway, she was just at home and she heard that Sheila had been arrested through social media. And I think she just panicked, and she knew that she didn't want to go through the whole ordeal of being arrested in public and, you know, police handcuffing her and having to go down to the station. So instead, Rachel just took herself to the police station and handed herself in. So now police had both of these girls arrested and charged. And suddenly news was hit in the media that these two teenage girls had been charged with the murder of their 16-year-old best friend. And all of a sudden, different people start coming out of the woodwork to tell police different things about these two girls. Mainly students from their school that knew both Skylar and Sheila and Rachel. This one boy told the police that he'd heard Rachel and Sheila talking about disposing a body. They were discussing how they would dispose of a body. And he thought that they were just joking at the time. But now that all of this was coming to light, he realised that he was listening in to a real conversation about a real murder that they were planning. It was so much more sinister now. Another report was actually from a teacher. A teacher came to police and said that she also had heard these two girls discussing disposing a body. But at that time, when the teacher overheard this conversation, there had actually been a body found in Star City. I don't really know the details behind that, but the teacher just thought that the girls were talking about that, and so she didn't think much into it, and now she realised that they probably weren't. So, now it came to the girls' murder trials. First up was Rachel Shoaf, and Rachel was actually offered a plea deal because she'd been so cooperative with police. She'd given them a full confession. She'd told them where Skylar's body was. I mean, I personally have a problem with that because, no, she wasn't cooperative. She'd lied for 6 months. Maybe she was cooperative in the end, but I don't think she should have gotten a plea deal for sitting on such horrific information for 6 months. But anyway, she was offered this plea deal, and if she pled guilty, she would get second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder. So Rachel Shoaf pled guilty to second-degree murder, and I have a little bit of her statement here that she read out in court. She said, "I am so sorry. I don't know if there is any way to make this apology because there are not even words to describe the guilt and remorse that I feel each day for what I have done. The person that did that was not the real me. I became scared and caught up in something I did not want to do. May God bring eternal peace to Skylar and the entire Neese family." After reading out that statement, Rachel Shoaf just sat down next to her attorney, and for the rest of the entire hearing, she just sat and sobbed. After she gave that statement, Skylar's father, Dave, then stood up and spoke directly to the judge and pled with him not to give Rachel that plea deal. He said that she should be up for the full sentence, just like Sheila. And I agree, because she wasn't cooperative. She waited 6 months. She put that family through 6 months of hell searching for their daughter when she knew that she had murdered her, that they had premeditated this murder for 9 months. But unfortunately, the decision was already made that Rachel Shoaf was going to get this plea deal, and the judge didn't change his mind. And so Rachel was sentenced to 30 years in prison with eligibility for parole after just 10 years. So that's pretty bloody soon. Sheila Eddy's trial was next, and of course she wasn't given a plea deal, and so hers was about to be a lot stricter. One of the main pieces of evidence that was used against Sheila Eddy was Rachel Shoaf's confession. It was all read out fully, and at the end, the judge or whoever asked Sheila if she agreed with everything that Rachel said, and Sheila said yes. So in essence, they kind of got a confession from Sheila as well. But Sheila was nowhere near as emotional as Rachel was in her trial. They didn't get a single tear out of Sheila the whole entire time. In fact, she actually smiled like a few times during this trial. How and why can you be smiling during your murder trial? In the end, Sheila Eddy was found guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of just 15 years, which is horrifying. As of May of 2013, there's actually a new law in West Virginia named Skylar's Law, which means that an Amber Alert can and will be issued for any missing child, no matter what the situation, whether they believe they're in danger or not, whether they're a runaway or not. And this means that any children in Skylar's position or positions similar to hers will be treated just as seriously as abduction cases. And hopefully, in turn, this can save a lot more lives. After all of this came to an end, the Neese family ended up suing both the Shoaf family and the Eddy family for the wrongful death of their child. They won this lawsuit and they were awarded $5 million from both of those families. Now, the Neese family know that they are never going to see that money. Of course not. The Eddy family, the Shoaf family do not have $5 million. But it's not about the money, actually, this lawsuit, because that's not the only benefit from the lawsuit. Another one of the outcomes is that both Rachel and Sheila will never be able to make money off of Skylar Neese's murder. That means they can't write a book about it, they can't do like documentary appearances or any other way that they could possibly make money off of this murder that they committed. It's all taken away because of this lawsuit. And that's why the Neese family did it. And that is all I have on this case. Thank you so much for watching. It really means a lot to me. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up on this video because that would really help me out. Thanks again to Function of Beauty for sponsoring this video. Remember, when you click the link down below in the description, they're giving you guys 25% off of your first 16-ounce set. And I really do recommend their shampoos and conditioners. I have been using them for years, I think since about 2019, and I haven't changed my hair care provider. So that's how you know it's real love between me and Function of Beauty. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting the channel and helping me decide the cases that I cover. All of my tier 2 members are on screen right now, so thank you so much. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the join button down below. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch another one of my videos, I'll leave you one right here. You can click on this one, or if you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click this circle right here. I post true crime content all the time. Anyway, bye!